Imagine a time before the Transcontinental Railroad, when the American West was an ocean of shifting sand and lethal heat that killed horses and mules in days. In 1856, the U.S. government imported a secret weapon from the Levant, a caravan of camels led by a Syrian-born wanderer named Haji Ali. While history books focus on cowboys and stagecoaches, they often omit the surreal sight of 60 humped beasts marching through the Texas dust and the red ghost that haunted the Arizona desert for decades after the Civil War ended. This is the true, strange, and heartbreaking odyssey of the U.S. Camel Corps. Chapter 1. The Vision of Jefferson Davis. The year was 1853, and the United States was a nation suffering from growing pains of a gargantuan scale. Following the Mexican-American War, the country had inherited a vast, sun-scorched empire stretching from the Rio Grande to the Pacific. But there was a problem. The great American desert was a graveyard. In the wood-paneled offices of Washington, D.C., Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, years before he would lead the Confederacy, sat hunched over maps of the Gadsden Purchase. He watched reports of supply wagons stalled by thirst and mules collapsing under the weight of gold seekers' dreams. "The horse is a creature of the meadow," Davis remarked to his colleagues, his voice gravelly. "But we are no longer a nation of meadows. We are a nation of dust. We need a beast that doesn't just survive the desert, but conquers it." Davis had been reading the journals of travelers in Egypt and Algeria. He became obsessed with the dromedary and the Bactrian. To the skeptics in Congress, the idea of importing old-world camels to the American West sounded like a fever dream or a circus act. But Davis was persistent. He secured a $30,000 appropriation from Congress, a king's ransom at the time, and dispatched Major Henry Wayne and Navy Lieutenant David Dixon Porter aboard the USS Supply to the ports of the Mediterranean. Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Levantines. When the USS Supply docked in Indianola, Texas in May 1956, the locals gathered at the pier, squinting through the heat haze. They expected soldiers. Instead, they saw something from the pages of the Bible. Down the gangplank stepped 34 camels, blinking at the Texas sun with long, rhythmic lashes. They were followed by a handful of camel drivers recruited from the Ottoman Empire. Among them was a young, charismatic man of Greek-Syrian descent named Philip Tedrow, who had converted to Islam and taken the name Haji Ali. To the rough-and-tumble Texans, Haji Ali was a mouthful. Within 48 hours, they had rechristened him Hi Jolly. Hi Jolly stood in stark contrast to the dusty U.S. dragoons. He wore a Mediterranean fez and embroidered vests, and he spoke to the camels in a language of clicks and guttural commands that the Americans found rhythmic and alien. While the U.S. soldiers tried to treat the camels like stubborn mules, often resulting in a face full of green, cud-filled spit, Hi Jolly treated them like royalty. "You do not break a camel," Hi Jolly warned a young corporal who was trying to beat a dromedary into submission. "You negotiate with him. If you lose his respect, you lose your life in the sand." Chapter 3. The Trial of the 35th Parallel. The real test came in 1857. Edward Fitzgerald Beale, a legendary explorer and former Navy officer, was tasked with surveying a wagon road from Fort Defiance, New Mexico, to the Colorado River. He was given 25 of the camels as his primary pack animals. The expedition was a grueling trek across the 35th parallel, land so rugged that even the most seasoned mountain men trembled. The mules began to fail almost immediately. Their hooves split on the volcanic rock. They required gallons of water that simply didn't exist. But the camels, they thrived. Beale's journals from the trail read like a love letter to the beasts. He watched how the camels packed 700 pounds each without complaint.
He watched in awe as the camels ate greasewood and prickly pear cactus, spines and all, which the mules wouldn't touch. Most incredibly, during one stretch of the journey, the camels went 10 days without a single drop of water, while the horses grew crazed with thirst. "It is beautiful to see them," Beale wrote by campfire light. "They move with a dignity that puts our frantic scurrying to shame." Haji Ali walks at the lead, singing to them. "I believe the camels are the only ones among us who know exactly where they are going." Chapter 4. The Shadow of War and the Red Ghost. The Camel Corps was an objective success, yet it was doomed by the very man who created it. As the 1860s dawned, the dark clouds of the Civil War gathered. Jefferson Davis left Washington to become the president of the Confederacy. Suddenly, the camel experiment was seen as a pet project of a traitor. The U.S. Army, preoccupied with the slaughter at Antietam and Gettysburg, lost interest in desert logistics. The camels were relegated to forts in California and Texas. Some were sold to circuses, others were auctioned to mining companies who used them to haul salt in Nevada. But many were simply turned loose into the wild. This led to one of the most chilling urban legends of the American West. In the 1880s, Arizona settlers began reporting sightings of a red ghost, a massive, terrifying red beast that ran like the wind and seemed to carry a dead man on its back. The legend turned out to be tragically true. A camel still wearing its military saddle had been found wandering the scrubland. Strapped to the saddle with heavy leather thongs were the skeletal remains of a human being. Whether it was a soldier who had tied himself on to survive a sandstorm or a victim of a grisly accident, no one knew. The red ghost became a symbol of a dream that had been abandoned by a nation at war with itself. Chapter 5. The Abandoned Vanguard. By 1861, the camel experiment was effectively orphaned. Jefferson Davis, the program's greatest champion, was now the President of the Confederate States of America. To the Union Army, the camels were Davis's pets, a political liability and a logistical nuisance. At Camp Verde, Texas, the camels were captured by Confederate forces. But the rebel soldiers, legendary for their horsemanship, had no patience for the stinking, spitting devils. They didn't understand the rhythmic chucking sounds High Jolly used to calm them. Instead, they tried to treat them like stubborn mules, leading to broken ribs and bruised egos. Some camels were used to haul cotton to Mexico. Others were simply neglected. Meanwhile, in California, the Union-held camels were auctioned off for a pittance. A single camel, which had cost the government hundreds of dollars to transport from Cairo, was sold to a mining company for $30. High Jolly watched as his brothers of the sand were led away in chains to work in the silver mines of Nevada and the salt flats of the Caribou. He followed them as long as he could, taking a job as a lead packer for a private company. But the American West was changing. The steam engine was beginning to scream across the plains, and the silence of the camel's gait was being replaced by the iron thunder of the locomotive. Chapter 6. The Curse of the Red Ghost. As the camels were sold into private hands, many escaped or were deliberately turned loose by frustrated owners who couldn't handle their temperament. This gave birth to the most terrifying piece of folklore in Arizona history, the Red Ghost. In 1883, in a remote corner of the Eagle Creek area, a woman was found trampled to death near her spring. The only evidence left behind were massive cloven footprints and tufts of reddish hair caught on a barbed wire fence. The settlers were terrified. They spoke of a giant red beast that could leap over high fences and kill a grizzly bear with a single kick. A few months later, a group of prospectors spotted the creature silhouetted against a ridge. As they raised their rifles, they realized with horror that the beast was not alone. Lashed to its humps with thick, weathered rawhide was a human skeleton. The bones clicked and rattled as the beast ran, one witness claimed. The skull stared at us, its jaw hanging open as if it were screaming silently across the desert. For years, the Red Ghost haunted the Arizona territory. It became a living nightmare for lonely ranchers. Eventually, a farmer named Mizzou Hastings shot the creature when it entered his garden. Upon inspection, they found the creature was a massive Bactrian camel, its back scarred and raw from the leather straps that had bound a corpse to it for years. Who the man was, a soldier, a lost traveler, or a cruel joke, remained a mystery that the desert refused to solve. Chapter 7. The Final Caravan of Philip Tedrow. While his camels were becoming legends and ghosts, High Jolly, born Philip Tedrow, was trying to find his place in a country that was rapidly becoming civilized. He officially became an American citizen, but he never truly left the desert. He spent his final years in the tiny outpost of Quartzsite, Arizona. To the locals, he was a living curiosity, a man who told stories of the Ottoman Sultan, the Great Pyramids, and the days when he led a caravan of 30 beasts through the virgin snows of the Sierra Nevada. He took up prospecting, wandering the hills with a single old mule, ironically the very animal the camels were supposed to replace. But whenever a dust storm kicked up or the heat mirages began to shimmer on the horizon, onlookers said High Jolly would stand and stare into the distance, perhaps expecting to see the swaying silhouette of a dromedary cresting the dunes. He died in 1902, penniless but respected. The townspeople buried him in the local cemetery, but they knew a simple wooden cross wouldn't suffice for a man of his history. Years later, the Arizona Highway Department built a pyramid-shaped monument over his grave, topped with a copper silhouette of a camel. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Sand. The story of the U.S. Camel Corps is more than a military footnote. It is a testament to the what-ifs of history. If the Civil War hadn't broken out, the American West might have been patrolled by camel-mounted cavalry. The Wild West might have looked more like the Sahara than a John Wayne movie. Remarkably, the camels didn't just disappear. Sightings of wild camels in the Southwest continued well into the 20th century. 1907, a wild camel was spotted near the Gila River. 1913, a group of surveyors in Baja California reported a small herd of 3 camels. In 1941, the last official sighting of a wild camel in North America was reported near Douglas, Arizona. Even today, hikers in the deep Mojave often find strange, oversized bones bleached white by the sun, bones that don't belong to a horse, a cow, or an elk. They are the remains of a dream that was too strange to live, but too resilient to die. Chapter 9. The Ghost of the 35th Parallel. By the autumn of 1857, the expedition led by Edward Fitzgerald reached the edge of the Colorado River. The expedition had been a brutal masterclass in survival. While the American mules were skeletal, their hooves cracked and bleeding from the volcanic rock of the Mojave, the camels looked as though they had just finished a light stroll through a park. Beale, a man of hard edges and little sentiment, found himself writing poetry in his logbooks about the beasts. "They are the most docile, patient, and hard-working creatures I have ever encountered," Beale wrote. "While the mules scream in the night for thirst, the camels kneel in the sand, chewing their cud with a dignity that shames all of us." But the soldiers under his command didn't share his romanticism. To a 19th-century American soldier, a horse was a partner. A camel was a foul-smelling, long-necked demon. They hated the way the camel smelled, a musk that made the horses stampede in terror. They hated the way the camels hissed when loaded with too much weight. And most of all, they hated that High Jolly was the only one who could control them. A night of the stampede. One moonless night near the Zuni Pueblo, a mountain lion crept into the camp. The horses caught the scent first. A panicked whinny turned into a full-blown stampede. In the chaos, 30 horses broke their tethers and vanished into the blackness of the canyon. The expedition was paralyzed. Without the horses, the men were stranded. "We go," High Jolly said, stepping into the firelight. He didn't ask for a horse. He approached Greek George, another Ottoman driver, and they mounted 2 of the swiftest dromedaries. For 3 days the camp waited. On the 4th morning, a rhythmic thud, thud, thud echoed against the canyon walls. High Jolly and Greek George appeared on the horizon, driving all 30 horses back into camp. The camels had tracked the horses through terrain no man could navigate, covering 60 miles without a single stop for water. For a brief moment, the American soldiers stopped laughing at the humped mules. They saw for the first time that the new Arabia Jefferson Davis envisioned was possible. Chapter 11. The Secret of the Red Ghost, Part 2. While the expedition pushed west, a darker story was brewing in the shadows of the Arizona Territory. As mentioned before, the Red Ghost was a camel with a corpse strapped to its back, but the identity of that man has been a subject of historical debate for over a century. New evidence and journals from the era suggest a chilling possibility. A young soldier, Elias Henderson had been court-martialed for cowardice and desertion of post during a skirmish with the Apache. Legend says his vengeful commander, rather than hanging him, lashed him to a wild, temperamental camel and turned it loose into the desert as a living death sentence. For years, the red ghost haunted the Arizona territory. It became a living nightmare for lonely ranchers. Eventually, a farmer named Mizzou Hastings shot the creature when it entered his garden. Upon inspection, they found the creature was a massive Bactrian camel, its back scarred and raw from the leather straps that had bound a corpse to it for years. Who the man was, a soldier, a lost traveler, or a cruel joke, remained a mystery that the desert refused to solve.
Chapter 13. The Last Caravan of Philip Tedrow. In his 70s, High Jolly lived in a small shack in Quartzsite. He was a man of two worlds, a Greek-Syrian Muslim living in the heart of the Wild West. He was known for his kindness, often sharing his meager rations with traveling prospectors. One evening in December 1902, a massive dust storm, a haboob, rolled across the Arizona plains. High Jolly, feeling the end was near, walked out into the swirling sand. He told his neighbor, "The caravan is calling. I can hear the bells." He was found the next morning, huddled against the base of a mesquite tree. He had died of natural causes, but his hands were gripped tight, as if he were holding the lead rope of a majestic beast. Chapter 14. Modern Echoes. To this day, the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division still keeps the history of the Camel Corps in their archives. But the true legacy lives in the Mojave. In the 1950s, a group of hikers near the Grand Canyon reported seeing a strange, long-necked deer that moved with a swaying gait. Biologists believe that small, feral populations of camels may have survived in the most inaccessible parts of the Southwest for nearly a century after the project ended. The desert does not forget, and if you stand in the middle of the Quartzsite Cemetery at sunset, looking at the pyramid monument of High Jolly, you might swear you hear the faint, ghostly sound of a camel's bell drifting on the wind. Chapter 15. The Treasure of the Blue Camel. As the camels were scattered to the winds, a new type of folklore emerged in the mining camps of Arizona and Sonora, the legend of the Golden Caravan. According to records from the early 1770s, a group of prospectors in the Superstition Mountains claimed to have seen a blue camel, likely a gray dromedary whose coat had been stained by the mineral dust of the copper mines, wandering near a hidden canyon. What made this sighting famous wasn't the animal itself, but what it was carrying. The camel was draped in heavy, rotted leather bags. As it ran, the bags tore, spilling high-grade gold ore across the rocks. For decades, camel chasers became a subset of Western outlaws. They weren't hunting for meat or hides. They were hunting for the living vaults, the escaped camels of the 1850s that were still carrying the lost payrolls and mining halls of a forgotten era. Chapter 16. The Great Camel Race of 1889. By the late 1880s, the camel had become a figure of mockery in the press, but a few visionaries still believed in their utility. In a desperate bid to prove the animal's worth one last time, a group of businessmen organized a race from Galveston, Texas, to Denver, Colorado. It was the Kentucky Derby of the desert. On one side were the finest thoroughbred horses the South could produce. On the other was a single, aging Bactrian camel named Old Joe, led by a former associate of High Jolly.
The horses took an early lead, their hooves thundering on the hard-packed soil. But as the elevation rose and the air thinned, the horses began to falter. Their lungs burned in the mountain air. They required massive amounts of grain and water. Old Joe, however, moved with a mechanical, swaying gait that never broke. He ate the pine needles and the scrub brush along the trail. When Old Joe arrived in Denver, he was 3 days ahead of the nearest horse. The crowd was silent. They realized that the camel wasn't a failure because of biology. It was a failure because of American pride. The U.S. was a horse nation, and to admit a camel was superior was a blow to the identity of the Western cowboy. Chapter 17. The Mystery of the Screaming Sands. In the deep Mojave, near what is now the Nevada-California border, there is a stretch of dunes known to the indigenous tribes as the Screaming Sands. In the 1890s, a group of U.S. surveyors reported a sound that haunted their sleep for weeks. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a coyote. It was a sound of deep guttural mourning, the lead surveyor noted in his report to the Department of the Interior. Eventually, they found the source. In a valley surrounded by high dunes, they discovered a camel graveyard. Hundreds of miles from any human settlement, a small, feral herd had established a ritual ground. The surveyors found the bones of dozens of camels, bleached white, arranged in a way that seemed almost intentional. This sparked a scientific mystery. Had the imported camels successfully adapted and created a new, wild American subspecies? Chapter 18. The Last Witness. The final chapter of the Camel Corps' physical presence in America came in 1934. In a small sideshow in a traveling circus in Mississippi, a very old camel named Topsy passed away. Topsy's skin was scarred with a faint, nearly invisible brand, U.S. Historians believe Topsy was the last direct link, the final survivor of the original 1857 shipment. She had lived through the Civil War, the Indian Wars, the invention of the automobile, and the start of the Great Depression. When she died, the last living soldier of the Camel Corps was gone.